Hello, and thank you very much for coming along. Today we're going to ruminate a bit on a saying by Professor Prosser Gifford. When everyone teaches, everyone learns. We're going to be exploring this through the world cultural studies that can happen now at places like Yale with the digital humanities. We're going to be looking at some new tools, resources, and perspectives in African studies. Professor Prosser Gifford's own field of interest. We're going to ask some questions and be able to start posing some larger research projects because of the digital humanities in this realm about how did Africa's industrious revolution create Europe's industrial revolution. Further, we're going to examine how we can understand European imagination and the imaging of Africa. Most of the time, in the early maps, for example, there are major distortions, including the Eurocentric imagination of imaging Africa totally upside down. Any freshman, any high school student looking at this asks right away, isn't there something wrong here? Yet it was the best image that Europeans had of Africa for decades in the early contact years. Then we're going to ask the question of how can we expand what we know and share what we learn in the exploration of the digital humanities at Yale. So to get to the program, you can point your browser in the internet or on an iPhone to transition-studies.net. It's simple enough to get to the basic program page. Then when you get there, search for the cite box over in the right-hand column, and you can enter the phrase Digital Humanities at Yale with the quotation marks. That'll make sure that it searches for the whole phrase. And you should end up by getting the response of the page that comes up in transition studies called When Everyone Teaches, Everyone Learns. Alternatively, you can simply just scan this QR code in. You don't need to teach high school students how to use cell phones these days, and they all know what QR codes are. So if you don't know how to do this yet, perhaps you can call upon the help of a high school student, scan in the code, and you should end up at this same page. Once you're connected to this weblog page through your browser, you can click on the links to many of the resources we'll be discussing in the next few minutes here. These include, for example, the Yale Art Gallery and the James Ross Archive of African Images, as well as the extensive catalog publications which they put out from time to time, including those on the Baule. Why start the study of the humanities and the arts? Well, in large part because at Yale, the study of African humanities began and was strongly supported from the history of art department with people like Robert Ferris Thompson, who actually was an undergraduate at Yale, then received an MA and then his PhD in 1965. His own work on the Flash of the Spirit, African and Afro-American art and philosophy became a kind of standard talking point within the field of African and Afro-American history for years and years and years. He also had a major role on the Yale campus as head of Timothy Dwight College, master of Timothy Dwight College. So much so was he revered that they painted his portrait with his characteristic chino pants and an open coat. He always had an open coat and a pair of chino pants on pretty much most of the time, and served at Yale as the longest master of a college in Yale's history, 32 years. So he's a major presence at Yale in the humanities. Beyond that, you can look at things at the Yale Center for British Art, and particularly art in the slave trade period, as well as publications that came out of that Center for British Art, in the sense that the primary material was drawn from there. There's a very famous book by Cheryl Finley on the iconography of the slave ship. You should look into it and get in touch with it through this page. Her study of the iconography of the African slave ship grew out of her study for the PhD in the Yale History of Art department. Beyond that, you want to look at the Gilda Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, which is a very active and, in fact, we'll see in a moment, ongoing center for the discussion and elaboration of scholarship in African and Afro-American history. And then, quite exceptionally, there is the Yale Library system as a whole, with particular digitized manuscripts in the Beinecke Library and its digitized map collections with access to links of priceless value in the Yale Digital Archives. In addition, the library system has links to virtually limitless connections in the external world beyond Yale through such portals as the African Map Circle, the African Historical Graphics Archive, and Afriterra. Afriterra is a historical map collection, and it's of major international importance, probably the largest single private collection. And it's very useful in its interactive capabilities. Yale students and anyone beyond can get access to it for their own reference work and research. Of course, there are other African study centers and research centers around the country that the Yale Library allows you to get links to very quickly. Let's briefly explore this portal then. It's not itself a page or a weblog with great content, but it points to other things which would enable you to undertake your own research whenever you wish. Well, if you scanned in the code, or if you put in the everyone teaches or the digital humanities at Yale, in quotes, in the search engine, you should have arrived at a page somewhat like this, landing on it as one of the other web pages that you get to in this weblog. If you scroll down, you'll see some hyperlinks to different things that are connected to digital resources for the study of African affairs at Yale, including the Yale University Art Gallery. If you click on that, you'll get right out to the University Art Gallery, and you can expand these pictures and learn more from what they post. In fact, clicking on the picture and getting details about the particular piece of African art that they are describing. But more to the point, you can get to other resources within the museum itself. Find out sort of item by item what they have, including the notes from the curator and related material. You can see about the conservation of particular collections and even get access to online connections for YouTube broadcasts. So you can talk about access through this portal to a lot of things that are available at Yale. This was a lecture that was given this past spring, Beads That Speak, Learning the Language of South African Beadwork. So this is the kind of thing available to you through the portal. And I'd urge you to start
document
getting out
camera live
and explore
handling.
these materials.
I'll hand it back over to James. Thank you.
So thank you. I just want to firstly welcome everyone and just thank you for joining this very special program, which, as you...
If you get back to the program, listen to the thing in its full length, but start consulting the other kinds of materials available through the webpage as well, including the Ross Archive of African Images. Long before European colonialism, there were images of Africa and African art that were recorded in sketches like these or photographs that were printed in European books with commentary. Now, the Ross Archive of African Images is an extraordinary collection, having gone through a lot of that published material and excerpted the descriptive material and the imagery that's involved in each. So if you click on some of these things, you can get out to the information that you need and start drawing upon this enormously rich collection for the study of African culture. Similarly, you can go out to the Yale Center for British Art through this portal. You all know where it is, over there, on the great side of the Yale campus called the Arts Avenue at one point. The art gallery's over further up the block. But in effect, you can get access to particular exhibits they've had, including art and the images of slavery in British Empire. The images are sometimes very subtle and fleeting. As you can see in this case, there are only the hands of a slave over here on the left, as he's holding a tray, probably with salt and pepper or something similar. Very marginalized, but they had a whole exhibit on the importance of imagery during the middle of the high slave trade period. Very interesting to study it. Slavery and portraiture in the 18th century Atlantic. Again, you can get access to these things and start to look at the assets that are available digitally online. In addition to individual exhibits, there are things that were the result of research done at the time on African American history. Particularly, Shel Finley has done a remarkable book on slave ship iconography. There was an event about it up at the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but she drew upon her PhD work in the art history department at Yale to discuss at great length the iconography of the slave ship in West Africa and its importance ever since in the understanding of the whole period of slavery and the phenomena of the transatlantic trade. Her work, again, can be accessed through this webpage, along with the Gilder Lehrman Center itself for the study of slavery and its aftermath, Gleaming in the Shadow of Slavery, conversation with descendants of African American of the old Yale, as it were. Well, it's in fact very filled with a whole series of materials that are forthcoming. This is going to start on Thursday, September 16th at 7 p.m. with introductions by David Blight, the prize-winning historian that is at the core of the Gilder Lehman Center. Beyond that, the Yale Library system itself has an extraordinary array of digitized manuscripts, including those documenting slavery, like this one, which was at the core of the work by Professor Robert Harms on the Diligent. The Diligent was the slave ship that was captured, and in fact, its records have been digitized. One journal that was retrieved was digitized and presented here to the Yale community through the digital archives. Beyond that, there are amazing collections of digitized maps that deserve to be explored at great length. These maps go way back and present enormous amounts of detail, which can be studied very closely now, much more closely than if, in fact, you ever had access to them physically. That seems like an ironic situation and not possible, but in fact, if you can expand the page and look at it by pinching your browser or cell phone or iPad in such a way as to expand the image, you can see far more detail here than you would have been able to in getting physical access to the original book. These are digitized at least 600 dots per inch and allow you to see a level of detail that you wouldn't be able to get to without an extraordinary array of little magnifying glasses and sort of micro telescopes. Even if you were in the presence of this volume atlas and its original pages. So make use of this. In fact, draw upon it to study the early images of Africa by Europeans. When you expand this one, for example, see a number of interesting things, including a group of Portuguese encountering Africans for the first time around the Castel de la Mina, that is to say, the castle of the mines. And those mines are very interesting because they're indicated here as La Mina de Portugal, Portuguese mines. There's also an indication of a camel here, as well as a monkey. The imagery of the camel, the lion, the elephant are not photographs. They're icons. Icons that represent what Europeans are trying to understand about this area that they know very little about. But I'd urge you to study these in detail and in particular start to look at some of the materials in the collection that are very problematic when you start with them and need to spend some time exploring them. When you look at something like this, for example, in an atlas, it looks very much upside down. And the reason is, it is very much upside down. This is an extraordinary representation of Eurocentrism because Africa itself is presented as if you're looking at it from the north. The north is in the bottom here, but you can see that even in this case, if you turn it around and put it the way we're used to seeing north at the top of the page, then if you expand it, all the writing is upside down. Now you can see that it was intended, therefore, to be seen in the other direction, as if Africa as a whole continent could be viewed and should be viewed, according to the map maker, as something that should be understood by looking at it from across the Sahara. And indeed, that's where all the indications are. The details are provided in the North African ports, not in the West African ports or in the South African ports. And it's that ability to use digital technology to gain access to something like this that really illustrates the power of the Yale digital collections. Try to look, for example, in the area of Senegal, in the Senegambia River, you get the indication of the river, Senegal and Gambra, but you have right next to it the indication of the Mali region, which means the Mali kingdom. Then you have the indication of Sierra Leone and eventually of Guinea. Cape Palmas and Cape Three Points, as well as La Mina. This is the same mine that we saw in the previous one, where the Portuguese had established in 1482 the first steps of constructing a castle. Well, this is very interesting as an asset to be drawn upon by those studying African history, which you can look at through the entire scope of European interactions with the continent, because the digital map collections go up to the recent times. You can also get access to things like the Hutchins Center up at Harvard and look at their material, in particular their different exhibits that are coming up, but also you can draw upon their institutes like their image of the Black African Archive and the library behind it. This is quite an extraordinary project of Skip Gates over the years and has been very instrumental in stimulating the study of African art and the art of Africans in Europe. Now available, the image of the Black in African and Asian art. This is a multi-volume series that's absolutely crucial for anyone looking at the interdisciplinary study of the African experience. So make use of the portal in order to get out to things that are both at Yale, but also those well beyond Yale, like the Hutchins Center and the extraordinary collection known as Afriterra, a cartographic free library that has digitized maps, again, on a very detailed scale that enable us to look in detail at different portions of the African coast, as well as at the annotations and illustrations provided by the map makers of some of what might be called the first ethnographic records of different peoples and cultures in Africa. This is a representation of the king of Benin, for example, being carried in regal style. Down on the coast itself, you get a very great indication of the different place names and the different groups that are associated with them. This can be expanded quite considerably to the point where you can see the detail of each one of these things, which would have been impossible if you just leaned over a case where it were exhibited. So these kinds of assets are available through the connections and the digitization material from Yale. This is not something that Prosser Gifford himself began, because the digitization process was not underway when he began teaching 50 years ago. Nevertheless, it was his beginnings in African history that allowed people to, in effect, create these kinds of collections since and expand the questions about the Industrial Revolution at the base of Europeans' Industrial Revolution, to look into why it is that European imagination got the imaging of African upside down initially and very problematically represented it ever since until the emergence of modern cartography. And it can ask the question of how we can expand what we now know and share what we've learned, because the new technology enables that to happen. We can expand the circle of the conversation because Zoom technology allows for international conferences like the ones that will be taking place at the Gilder Lehrman Center later this semester. So have a look around, enjoy the assets made available, and think about the context that enabled the creation of this kind of digital humanities asset at Yale. This then represents a bit of what you can find through that research portal. But we ought to remember and celebrate, in a sense, the life and contribution of Prosser Gifford. He received his PhD at Yale in 1964 because of the work he had done, field work, and then write-up in his dissertation on what was known then as Northern Rhodesia. He became the first professor to teach courses in African history in the history department. And for this reason, he started many very important precedents and created a path for other people to follow. As he once observed to his students, when everyone teaches, everyone learns. What he meant by this was something that he had to explain to his undergraduates, because he regularly invited his undergraduates to join the graduate seminar. Now, this was unusual at the time because in lecture courses, you're expected to get, as an undergraduate, sort of wisdom from the sage on stage. He did his share of that, but he also wanted us as undergraduates to join in the discussions that the graduate students were having. As he put it, when everyone teaches, everyone learns. And in the graduate seminars, it was the graduate students who were responsible week after week after week to put something forward, usually a chapter in their dissertation or a prospectus of what they wanted to undertake. They had to put that forward and defend it. Now, when you do that, as he well knew, that's when you really started to learn about your subject matter, because you had to represent it to other people. So we were a little surprised as undergraduates when he gave up his role as lecturer and said, okay, you take over. And then he turned to the person who was responsible for that week's presentation as a graduate student. But as he explained to us, when everyone teaches, everyone learns. In his day, who was everyone? Well, it was pretty amazing because he started to draw the circle wider and wider, certainly wider than most professors at Yale at the time. There were, of course, Yale students. That's what he was hired to teach. And that rapidly became Yale undergraduates plus Yale graduate students. In our day, you could say this is different, but in fact, he at the time included other Yale faculty in these seminars. There became, in effect, an African studies seminar that was based on his African history teaching. The other faculty included people like William Roger Lewis, very famous historian, with whom Prosser Gifford worked very closely while at Yale and produced books like Britain, Germany, and Africa. Roger Lewis went on to publish an extraordinary array of very important historical studies on his own on British imperialism and comparative imperialism in the British and French and even Belgian traditions, as well as for the decolonization as well as colonization of the empires from Europe. He became eventually president of the American Historical Association and was awarded several major international awards and citations as a commander of the British Empire, for example, for editing the Oxford History of the British Empire. He's been duly celebrated, and he is now widely known as a co-author with Prosser Gifford on many important pieces of African history. Beyond other faculty, Prosser Gifford included Yale staff. Now, this was very unusual at the time, and certainly not frequently done now. But the key staff person was Moore Crossy. He was the country's leading Africana librarian based in Sterling Library at the time, and he became a regular participant in Prosser's weekly seminars. He was deferred to on questions of documentation. He knew almost everything. We certainly thought he knew almost everything. And if he didn't, he'd find it out very quickly. He was an extraordinary talent and amazingly knowledgeable person about sources in African history and African cultural studies more generally. At the time, the Yale community did not include Yale alumni, but it does now. And it's interesting the way in which the digital revolution that has come along since Prosser Gifford taught at Yale has included this largely ignored sector of the Yale community until now. The reason is that the digital technology that's extended itself into the study of the humanities now makes it possible to include alumni in a way never previously possible. They can join webinars. They can join Zoom sessions. And in fact, increasingly they do. Now, this is quite important in one key respect. Numerically, the Yale alumni form about 10 times the size of both the undergraduates, graduates, faculty, and staff put together. In terms of the Yale community, the Yale alumni carry a lot of weight. And of course, in our digital age, it's the entire internet connected world that can sit in on webinars if invited, and they can join in with insights never previously available to those within the narrow circuit. Narrow, not because it intended to be, but because by background, training, and experience, they just don't have as large a perspective on things as they are sometimes needed in dealing with something like African history and culture. There have been important virtual gatherings, for example, that are now available for viewing on the internet, including the Transatlantic Slavery Symposium, which just took place a few months ago. And in fact, Yale is joining in this tradition themselves. Another online conference is forthcoming from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale. In October, there's going to be a major consideration of Yale and slavery in historical perspective, with an introductory message from the president of the university and a keynote speech by David Blight. It's going to be quite an event, something you'd want to link into. In addition, of course, on an international scale, the BBC has posted a 16-part series on global slavery. We think slavery has only to do with the New World, and that it occurs only because we take an interest in it in the Americas. Not quite so. As the BBC indicates in this actually 17-part series, you should look at the whole thing. Now, you can learn a lot about Africa from looking at old maps. And one of the things that you do learn is the Eurocentric perspective of most of writings and scribblings and drawings of Africa. We can gain new insights from these old maps if we can study them in close enough detail. Yale is known for the close study of maps. In fact, they just discovered that the Finland map, which they thought was one of the earliest maps of the New World, in fact, is a fraud. And they have no hesitation in doing this kind of scholarship, even on some of their most venerable treasures in the library, in the Reinecke Library. But it's because of people like Prosser Gifford, who began the study, systematic study, of the Eurocentric perspective of Africa, that groups like the Africa Map Circle have emerged to look at these things with the digital tools now available. This is an international enterprise at this point. Consider, for example, the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, where the Department of History has just issued a call for papers later this year. The call went out on the 19th of July, 2021, but it's going to be looking at the whole question of the repatriation, and reclaiming, in some sense, of the African heritage on the part of the African diaspora and other global contexts. Now, this is very interesting because it's not just the African repatriation that they're going to be focusing on, but the repatriation of people across the world who are claiming a link to previous cultures or previous territories that they had been part of. They'll be looking at contexts, practices, understandings, and constructions, mental constructions, intellectual constructions, conceptual constructions. Very interesting set of papers going to be forthcoming for a seminar, an international webinar that will be held based in the Department of History at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Last year in 2020, the Zoom platform made it possible to conduct an international conference online to share historical maps and research. The idea was pretty simple. There have been a lot of new collections of old maps that have been digitized, and these can now be combined with imagery from Google Earth. They can, in fact, be georeferenced and studied in great detail. Further, those studies can be shared, and the discussions about them can be shared with Zoom technology on an international scale. This is what's led to the Africa Map Circle and to the elaboration of seminars on these materials across all national boundaries, all cultural traditions, and all, in fact, linguistic barriers, because translations can be made available of these sessions. The Yale University libraries are very rich for recovering and discovering, for this reason, world history through the digital humanities. They've been doing this for a long time. And in fact, it's carved in stone on the entrance to the Sterling Memorial Library, where written traditions as old as they come in the human condition are preserved. Yale's collection of cuneiform tablets are some of the earliest writings ever known to humankind. And they've preserved and maintained that collection through both Roman and Greek, Sumerian, and Assyrian traditions. Furthermore, they've extended this into the digital age by converting what used to be the periodical section of the library into the Digital Humanities Lab. They did this back in 2018, but it's been underway ever since. And under the capable leadership now of a woman who has a great deal of experience in this area. She was at Yale previously as the former recipient of the Kress Fellowship in Art Librarianship in the Haas Family Arts Library. Since then, she had experience with the Mellon Foundation, JSTOR, the International Bibliographic and Reference resource that's digitally available online, and the Columbia University Library, before she was asked to come back as the Stephen F. Gates, 1968, University Librarian. This is one of the first examples of an endowed position for a librarian. She's the second recipient of this chair, as it were, but she comes with extraordinary capacity and interest in digital humanities. She understands what it means to look at an integrated art, historical map, and photographic collection, for example, something that could span all of the material traditions in Yale's museums, their rare book libraries, and their manuscript collections. Prosser Gifford then is remembered for having started with his first teaching a lot of this, but he didn't take it to its fruition. He was only here for a few years before he left for Amherst College, then on to the Smithsonian Institution, and then head of academic programs at the Library of Congress. Before he left, though, members of the class of '68 celebrated his presence because, in addition to being the first professor of African history, he became the director of a group known as the 5-year BA program. He was concerned that Yale students, who at the time were facing the draft, have an alternative to go and study and live in places in the third world, whether it was Latin America or India, the Pacific, or Africa itself, because that experience had been very important for him. And he realized how important it could be for those in their formative years in college. At the time, the only way people could do that was to join the army and start shooting, because it was the height of the Vietnam War. And if you dropped out of the normal sequence of a 4-year progression through college, you were in danger of being drafted immediately to go fight in the Vietnam War. Prosser Gifford found this intolerable, and he worked with President Kingman Brewster to create a group known as the 5-year BA group. People who would take 5 years to get their BA because they were going to take a year out to work in a developing country. So, not long ago, close to the 50th anniversary of the class of 1968, the first class of those students who benefited from that program celebrated his contribution not only as an African historian, but as director, first director of the Yale 5-year BA program. He and his wife, Dee Dee, were the ones that made it possible for these very grateful students to take this enriching year without being drafted into the military to fight in Vietnam. When they gathered, it was quite a significant ceremony in one key respect. Dee Dee and Prosser Gifford were there, but in addition, before he left in 1967, Prosser saw to it that his successor was named. The successors were Jackie and Sidney Mintz. Now, in the history of the humanities at Yale, this is quite an extraordinary step because Jackie and Sidney Mintz served for years on the Yale faculty, in addition to being administrators of this new program, the 5-year BA program. Sid had a position as a senior member of the anthropology department and a specialist in New World Afro-Americana. He assisted in the creation, for the first time ever at Yale, of a class that presided over the graduation of the first class fivers. Since they had started in class of 68 and took a year out, they didn't graduate to the class of 69. But as part of their demands in coming back, they wanted to know more, especially about other parts of the world. And as you'll see in the history of the Yale archives, it was in that year of 69 that Yale created for the first time an African American Studies program with a large advice, input, and in fact, blueprint written up for it by Sidney Mintz. He administered that program as well as advising students about it because he was a specialist in Puerto Rican and Cuban slavery. One of the first students that he had is recognizable now on a national basis. He came through the African American Studies program at Yale and then went on to other institutions, including Princeton and Cornell, and then eventually Harvard. There, he's been a major light, both at that institution, but also nationwide. In effect, he is the director at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. Unlike Yale, which split off African studies and African American studies, Skip Gates has forever tried to keep the two in balance and in conversation with one another, which he's been able to do as the director and in fact administrator of this new center created under his direction. It's important to realize that he went on from that center to create a whole series of other things, including a group called the History Design Studio. Henry Louis Gates has fostered the integrated study of art and history nationwide through the History Design Studio that he helped to create as part of the Hutchins Center at Harvard. Yale now has its own digital humanities lab, and it too can be used for this kind of enterprise. Across the country, African American studies programs have in effect integrated this kind of study in the digital humanities to their work, following the lead of Yale and Harvard. For this reason, we're particularly grateful for the example of Prosser Gifford, who started this process over 50 years ago,